The courtroom was unusually packed for a Tuesday afternoon. Sunlight streamed in through the high windows, casting long shadows on the oak-paneled walls. A hushed murmur passed through the gallery, the kind that signaled something or someone was out of the ordinary. Courtroom regulars, including a few local journalists and law students looking for real-life drama, had caught wind of a particularly strange case. A teenager was being charged with cybercrimes, and apparently he had no legal representation. Even stranger, he had refused a public defender. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the door swung open with a faint creak. In walked Malcolm Brooks, 17 years old, 5'9", with a wiry build, and the kind of calm that didn't quite fit the situation. He wore a dark hoodie, clean but clearly worn, faded jeans and well-used sneakers. His hands were buried deep in the front pocket of the hoodie, and his curly hair framed a face that looked tired but focused. He didn't look scared. He didn't look defiant either. He just looked calm, purposeful. Judge Ronald Halbrook seated on the high bench, adjusted his glasses, and took one look at the teenager before scoffing slightly under his breath. Known for his impatience with what he called youthful nonsense, Halbrook had a reputation for being sharp-tongued and quick to dismiss. He leaned forward slightly, peering at Malcolm with thinly veiled amusement. "So," the judge said, tapping a finger on his desk, "this is the accused? Malcolm Brooks?" Malcolm looked up and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Halbrook raised his brows. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a real tech whiz kid. What's the charge again? Hacking into the school district systems, changing grades? Or were you just bored and decided to flex your digital muscles? There were a few chuckles from the crowd, court observers, a couple of law clerks. Even the bailiff tried to suppress a grin. But Malcolm didn't respond. He just kept his eyes locked on the judge, unflinching. Halbrook continued, "Tell me, son, did you learn your hacking skills playing video games or watching too many crime dramas? Or maybe you just Googled how to be a criminal genius one night after failing a math test." The courtroom wasn't exactly laughing, but the tension eased slightly as people assumed this would be another open and shut case with a teenage defendant out of his depth. They were wrong. Malcolm walked slowly toward the defense table, not even glancing at the prosecutor. Instead of sitting down in the chair meant for defendants, he remained standing behind it. He placed his backpack on the table, unzipped it methodically, and pulled out a thick manila folder and a small, clear plastic case. He placed both items in front of him and waited. Judge Halbrook tilted his head. "You waiting for your lawyer to show up, Mr. Brooks?" Malcolm reached into the folder and pulled out a laminated card, holding it up steadily. "No, Your Honor, I'm not waiting for anyone. I am the lawyer." The silence in the room was deafening. For a second, everyone thought it was a joke, a stunt. Some thought maybe he was bluffing, trying to make a statement or cause a scene before being escorted out. But Malcolm didn't blink. His expression remained neutral, almost bored. Halbrook narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed. "Son, this isn't a school debate. This is a real courtroom. You don't just declare yourself a lawyer and start pretending to know what you're doing. That's not how this works." "I'm not pretending," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. "I passed the bar exam through the state's equivalency system. I was legally permitted to take the exam under a rarely used clause that allows non-traditional applicants to qualify based on independent study, verified legal apprenticeship, and test scores." He slid the laminated ID across the table. It was real. State issued. His name, Malcolm E. Brooks. Title, legal practitioner, provisional certification. He also handed up a printed letter from the State Bar Association, confirming his eligibility and recent certification. Judge Halbrook looked at the documents, took off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. The courtroom was still. No one was laughing now. Even the prosecutor, who had been half scrolling through her notes on an iPad, looked up in surprise. "I'll be defending myself today," Malcolm said, his tone completely even. And I'd like to begin by filing a motion to suppress the evidence obtained during my arrest. The warrant was improperly filed, and the search of my home violated both state and federal protections under the Fourth Amendment. He flipped, opened the manila folder, and began pulling out documents. Legal briefs, references to precedent-setting cases, annotated copies of the warrant, and a timeline of the police department's actions. Halbrook sat back in his chair, staring at Malcolm, like he was looking at a ghost. He didn't say anything for a long moment, then finally asked, Where did you learn all this? Libraries, Malcolm replied. Online case archives, legal forums, and I apprenticed with a retired attorney in my neighborhood. She taught me how to think, not just what to memorize. The judge looked down at the ID again. It wasn't fake. It couldn't be. The bar wouldn't issue something like this lightly. He felt a twinge of something he hadn't felt in a courtroom in years. Humility. The prosecutor leaned toward her assistant and whispered something, clearly unsettled. The assistant began typing furiously on a laptop, probably verifying everything Malcolm had just said. And Malcolm? He stood there with the calm assurance of someone who didn't need to prove anything. He wasn't rattled by the audience or the judge's sarcasm. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just there to do his job. The judge stared at the documents in front of him, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in his courtroom. The idea that a 17-year-old had legally passed the bar exam and was now standing in front of him, not as a defendant in need of mercy, but as a certified legal practitioner, was hard to process. He flipped through the laminated ID, the verification, letter from the Bar Association, and the legal briefs with neat annotations in Malcolm's handwriting. They weren't just convincing, they were impeccable. Every I dotted, every T crossed. This some kind of prank? The judge finally asked, more out of disbelief than mockery this time. No, Your Honor, Malcolm replied, his voice steady and respectful. I assure you this is very real. If you would allow, I'd like to proceed with my motion to suppress the prosecution's evidence on the basis that it was obtained through an illegal search and seizure. Halbrook cleared his throat, trying to reestablish his authority. He glanced at the prosecutor, a woman in her 30s named Dana Kessler, who had just pulled out her phone and started whispering to someone on the line. Probably a colleague at the DA's office or a clerk checking the credentials Malcolm had provided. Her face said everything. She hadn't expected this. The judge exhaled. Fine. Proceed. Malcolm opened the folder in front of him and carefully pulled out a stack of papers clipped together. Your Honor, the search warrant used to enter my home was filed under the wrong district code. The arresting officers used a jurisdictional tag that expired in 2019. That alone is enough to invalidate the warrant. But it goes deeper. He handed a copy of the warrant to the bailiff, who brought it to the bench. Halbrook examined it, squinting slightly, then glanced at Malcolm. The expiration, the judge asked? Line 13 at the bottom. The statute listed was updated in 2020. The officers failed to cite the new code, which they were required to do by law once the change was implemented. The judge looked back down at the document, and then to the prosecutor, who was now flipping furiously through her own notes. Malcolm continued, calmly but with growing intensity. In addition, the affidavit used to obtain the warrant was based on digital evidence that had no verified chain of custody. The IP logs they traced to my device were pulled from a public library Wi-Fi connection, where I also conducted volunteer tutoring sessions. That router supports multiple dynamic IPs per device. Meaning, Judge Halbrook interrupted. There's no way to definitively prove it was your computer? Correct. Not without additional verification, which they failed to acquire. Malcolm moved to the next document. Here is a copy of the router's manufacturer manual, which explains how its address allocation system works. I've highlighted the section on IP rotation. Halbrook skimmed the page. He looked impressed, but he was trying not to show it. Furthermore, Malcolm said, my fingerprints were not found on the keyboard that was supposedly used for the breach, and the metadata from the USB stick they recovered was modified 3 days after it was seized, which suggests tampering, possibly even inside the evidence locker. A hush fell over the room. No one had expected this kind of detail. Even the stenographer had paused momentarily, her fingers hovering in shock before returning to the keys. The audience in the gallery leaned in closer, eyes wide. Prosecutor Kessler stood up suddenly. Your Honor, I'd like to request a short recess to review this new information.
Halbrook looked at her, then at Malcolm, and then back at the mountain of paperwork on his desk. The judge could sense the ground shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't a case of a teenager in over his head, play acting as a lawyer for attention or sympathy. This was a methodical dismantling of the prosecution's entire case. This is hardly new information, Malcolm said before the judge could respond. Everything I've just presented was submitted in my pretrial motion. The prosecution had 10 days to respond and failed to do so. I have the time-stamped receipt from the court clerk's office. He handed the receipt over without being asked. Judge Halbrook looked it over, then sighed, deeply this time, not out of frustration, but something closer to reluctant admiration. He turned to the prosecutor. "Counselor, is this true?" Kessler hesitated. "It appears so, Your Honor. I must have overlooked it." "Overlooked it?" the judge repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I was under the impression this was a juvenile case, and I didn't anticipate a motion this complex," she admitted, clearly flustered. Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just waited patiently, as if he had all the time in the world. "Mr. Brooks," the judge said after a long pause, "you've put forth a compelling argument. I have to admit I'm surprised. I think most of us here are, but I'm also impressed. You've demonstrated a clear understanding of legal procedure and constitutional law, and you've done it without once stepping out of line." Malcolm gave a polite nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." Halbrook took off his glasses again, this time setting them down slowly. This court has seen a lot of young people, and unfortunately, not all of them are lucky enough to understand the system. They're thrown into, I admit, when you walked in, I assumed you were just another kid playing games with something serious. But you've shown a level of preparation that puts even some seasoned attorneys to shame. The judge looked back at the prosecutor. "Unless the state can provide concrete evidence that counters Mr. Brooks' claims, I don't see how this case can move forward. The motion to suppress is provisionally granted. I'll review the files in more detail, but for now, I suggest the prosecution reevaluate its strategy." Kessler sat down, visibly deflated. She nodded, but her eyes never left Malcolm. Halbrook leaned back in his chair and studied the teenager standing before him. "You've clearly done your homework, Mr. Brooks. You know the law, and more importantly, you respect it. That's rare." Malcolm didn't react much. He simply placed the remaining documents back into his folder with quiet precision. Everything about him, his posture, his tone, his choice of words, exuded maturity beyond his years. There was no arrogance, no swagger. Just facts, just law. And in that courtroom, surrounded by professionals who had likely dismissed him the moment he walked in wearing a hoodie and sneakers, Malcolm had turned the entire room on its head by doing exactly what the legal system was built for. By defending himself with truth, logic, and undeniable competence. The courtroom was silent for a long stretch after the judge's ruling. No one quite knew what to say. People shifted in their seats, some blinking in disbelief, others murmuring softly to one another. The bailiff looked unsure whether to relax or stand at attention. The stenographer, after catching up with her notes, glanced at Malcolm with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and admiration. The tension that had once filled the air with anticipation had now been replaced by something heavier. Reverence, maybe even humility. Malcolm stood where he had been for nearly the entire proceeding, his hands resting gently on the defense table, his file closed neatly before him. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't basking in the attention or gloating in victory. If anything, he looked a little tired, but there was peace in his eyes, the kind that only came from knowing you had spoken the truth and been heard. Judge Halbrook slowly leaned forward, folding his hands together atop the bench. He studied Malcolm as if trying to fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. A kid, a literal teenager, had walked into his courtroom, faced a felony charge, and proceeded to tear apart the prosecution's case with a level of legal dexterity that rivaled seasoned attorneys. Not just that, he had done it without theatrics, without emotional outbursts, and without once straying from court decorum. "Mr. Brooks," the judge finally said, his voice quieter now, "this court owes you an apology." The words came out carefully, as though he'd never had to say them in quite this way before. The courtroom went still again. The phrase apology was not one commonly heard from Judge Halbrook's bench. He was known for being strict, sardonic, even unforgiving. But in this moment, he sounded like a man who understood that he'd underestimated someone and that it mattered. Malcolm nodded slightly. "I'm not here for apologies, Your Honor, just justice." There it was again, that composed, matter-of-fact, tone that made it hard to remember he was just 17. No bravado, no ego, just a calm statement of purpose. His words didn't seek pity or praise. They simply landed, quietly, like a gavel on wood. Judge Halbrook's gaze softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Well, justice is what you've gotten today. And frankly, what you've given this court. He turned toward the prosecution's table. Counselor, unless you can present any new evidence or intent to refile under different charges, I see no reason to continue. I am dismissing this case. Kessler, who had spent the last 10 minutes in silent mortification, stood slowly. No objection, Your Honor, she said quietly. Her usual confidence had evaporated. She looked over at Malcolm and gave a slight nod of respect. It wasn't a gesture of concession. It was one of recognition. She knew she'd been outmatched, not by another veteran lawyer, but by a teenager who had done his homework better than anyone else in the room. The judge banged the gavel once. Case dismissed. Mr. Brooks, you're free to go. Malcolm calmly gathered his folder, slipped it back into his backpack, and zipped it closed. He didn't linger. He didn't wave, or bow or acknowledge the audience, though their eyes followed him like he was walking out of a movie. He just slung the bag over his shoulder, adjusted his hoodie, and walked toward the doors at the back of the courtroom. But before he reached them, something happened. A middle-aged man in the gallery stood up and started clapping. It was slow, uncertain at first, but sincere. Then someone else joined in, and another. Within seconds, half the courtroom was on its feet, applauding. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was reverent, like they were witnessing something rare and important, something that didn't happen in courtrooms often enough. Malcolm stopped just before the doors and turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the room. He didn't smile, but he dipped his head once, grateful, polite, and resolute. Then he pushed through the doors and was gone. Outside, reporters had already gathered, tipped off by courthouse staff that something strange was going on. They were waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps, cameras rolling, mics out, voices overlapping as they threw questions into the crisp afternoon air. Malcolm, is it true you passed the bar at 17? How did you learn law so young? Do you plan to open your own firm? Are you suing the school or the police? He walked down the steps calmly, ignoring the shouts. The hoodie was up again, shielding him from the cameras, from the flashes, from the chaos. He kept walking. No entourage, no lawyer, no parent by his side. Just a backpack full of paperwork and a silence that said everything he didn't feel. Like explaining. Someone ran after him, a younger journalist with a notepad instead of a mic. Mr. Brooks, just one question. Why did you do it yourself? Why not hire a lawyer? Malcolm stopped. He didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. Because I had to prove something, he said. To the court? The reporter asked. No, he said. To myself. Then he turned and disappeared into the city. Just a teenager, a hoodie, and a story that would echo far beyond the courthouse walls. That evening, the internet exploded. Clips from the courtroom leaked online, snippets of his legal argument. The moment he held up his bar ID, the judge's stunned reaction. Within hours, your teen lawyer and Malcolm Brooks were trending nationwide. News anchors ran segments calling him a prodigy. Legal podcasts dissected the case like it was a law school final exam. Law professors referenced him as a once-in-a-generation talent. And somewhere in all the noise, people started asking bigger questions about education, about access, about the system, and who it truly serves. But Malcolm wasn't online for any of it. He didn't post on social media. He didn't schedule interviews or capitalize on the attention. He returned home, made himself a sandwich, and began working on his next legal brief. It was for a neighbor, an immigrant mother being unfairly evicted, another case, another fight, another chance to speak up for someone who couldn't. Because Malcolm Brooks wasn't just trying to prove he was smart, he was trying to prove that justice didn't care about age, background, or how scuffed your sneakers were. And in one courtroom on one ordinary afternoon, he reminded everyone why the law matters and who it's meant to protect.